Hello my friends, and welcome to my FPS and visibility guide for ARC creators. We are going to go over every single graphical setting to see what is the best option in order to figure out a fine balance between FPS and visibility, which is essential for your competitive edge. At the end, I will go over some of the audio settings as well, if you are interested. So let's dive into it. And first things first is the windowed mode. Borderless full screen is your best option. No one uses windowed, and exclusive full screen is not recommended by the game, so I cannot recommend it either. Best option, go with borderless full screen. If you turn on NVIDIA frame generation, then you lose access to these things here. But I do highly recommend you use DLSS frame gen. As you can see on the top right, you do gain a fair bit of latency. It's around 4 to 6 milliseconds, but in the grand scheme of things, you do gain a fair amount of frames as well. And in my opinion, that is worth the hit there. For the sake of the video though, I'm gonna go through everything without frame generation because I went through all of the quality settings and my FPS comparisons are done with the frame generation off. The only reason my latency just increased is because I have reflex low latency off, but if I turn it on, it goes down a fair bit. So if you don't use DLSS frame generation, turn NVIDIA reflex low latency on 100%. VSync, keep it off. But like I said, if you have frame generation on, these settings here, they won't matter. And moving on to resolution scaling and anti-aliasing, if you have an RTX card, then obviously NVIDIA DLSS is your best bet. The DLAA obviously is the best visual, but you also don't gain any frames from the resolution downscaling or upscaling, I should say. If you go to quality, you have 70 or 67% resolution scaling. The game still looks good and you get a ton of frames from it. And not to mention, when you are always running around, you never notice the small details that are on the walls anyway. So going down to quality, I think, is a no-brainer just to get some extra frames. Unless you have a very beefy PC, then you obviously can play DLAA. But me personally, I recommend quality. I think that's the best quality to performance ratio that we have. When it comes to the DLSS model, the FPS difference is about 8% between CNN and Transformer, but Transformer looks a lot better. So do with that information what you want. Me personally, I'm going to go with Transformer and get a little bit more clarity. If you have an AMD card, then obviously you can just use AMD FSR quality. It doesn't look as good as NVIDIA, but it's the best you got, because I think the other ones don't look as good either. There's a little bit of flickering happening in the trees and on the edges in the distance. I don't know how well you can see, but you can see it on TAUU, for example. There's a lot of flicker in there. I reduced the render resolution to 67%, which is equivalent to NVIDIA's and AMD's quality setting on their resolution scaling. So as you can see, a lot of flickering, and you definitely don't want to see that. Same with TSR. So NVIDIA DLSS, without a doubt, the best option. If you have an AMD card, use AMD FSR on quality, or DLAA if you can spare the frames. Moving on to field of view, obviously, that is completely personal preference. If you want that, if you want to be a little closer, I think 70 for me. Personally, I just like the way it is, and I've just gotten used to 70 at this point. Motion blur, keep disabled, obviously. Moving on to ray tracing. Ray tracing, obviously, the best option in terms of frames is static. Epic to static is around 21% FPS difference, so obviously a massive hit. But if you can get your monitor's refresh rate on medium or low, then obviously I would recommend going with that just for the visual side of things. But if you want the competitive edge and you want the frames, then static is without a doubt the best bet. Moving on to view distance. View distance is a bit of a weird one, because on low, obviously, it looks absolute garbage. Some of the trees, they don't even render in. And as you can see, there's like some of the bushes here that don't render in until you get to high. So for me personally, I feel like view distance on Epic is kind of a must, but I think medium is the lowest acceptable, unless you have an absolute toaster of a computer. In that case, I am sorry, but obviously use low if you want, or if you want to have a massive competitive edge, because if there's someone hiding behind that tree, you will be able to see him. Same with these rocks here, but obviously if you shoot them, that tree will still be in the way, and you'll be wondering why you're not hitting your shots. So me personally, I want to keep it on Epic, and I just want to demonstrate how bad it actually looks on low. So if we go into the lobby here and we run around, you can see things are popping in one by one. This even happens on Epic to an extent, but obviously as you keep going up on the settings, the less of an effect it will have. So like I said, if you want a massive competitive edge in terms of spotting players, go with low. Me personally, I want Epic because I want to eliminate the pop-in effect as much as I possibly can. Anti-aliasing doesn't do anything because that is controlled by your resolution scaling and anti-aliasing here. And even if you turn the resolution scaling off, this still doesn't do anything. So low or Epic, it doesn't matter, it has no effect on your frames. Shadows, I would recommend medium minimum, because if you go to low, you can see all the shadows do disappear, including your own shadows. So that obviously includes other players as well. So in terms of fighting players, I would recommend having it on medium. So if you do want to limit the detail of shadows on the ground, obviously go with low, just for the sake of seeing player shadows. The FPS difference between epic to low is around 13%, but if you go to low, or from low to medium, it's around 4%, so I am willing to sacrifice those frames. If you are struggling to get decent frames, then go down to low, and you'll be fine. So post-processing, as you can see, it adds a little bit of depth to your trees, specifically foliage. So as you can see here, if you go from low, it's kind of plain, but you go to medium, it adds a little bit of depth. It looks a lot nicer. If you go on to higher, it does increase that a little bit more, but it's not as noticeable. So my recommendation would be to keep it on low if you want to have the competitive edge in terms of if someone's in that bush, that's your best chance of spotting them. Medium, if you want that nice visual. The FPS difference between epic and low is around 8%, but if you go from low to medium, it's only 2%. So for me, that's a no-brainer. I'm going to keep it on medium because I want that little bit of nice visuals. Because usually, if someone's camping in a bush, I'm blind as a bat and I won't see them regardless. And texture is pretty simple. It depends on your graphics card. If you have 8 GB of VRAM, I would recommend keep it on high. If you have more than 8, you can easily go to epic without no issues. If you have less than 8 GB, then medium or low is probably your best bet. But for me personally, I don't see a high FPS increase or decrease, whatever I choose here, so I'm gonna go with epic myself personally. But like I said, that depends on your graphics card. Now, effects have a pretty significant impact to your frames as well. It is 14% between low and epic, but it's also very hard to see what it actually does. So if you look at the ground here, it does say that controls quality of effects like particles, subsurface scattering, and sky atmosphere. I will show you the sky in a moment, but if you look at the floor here, the subsurface scattering, I don't notice any difference. Literally zero difference, for my eyes at least. The only difference I can see is on the clouds. So if you look at the clouds right now, you can see a little bit of pixelation there, but it's not as noticeable. But if you reduce it down to low, it becomes more noticeable here. As you can see right there, as the edges of the clouds kind of dissipate, there's a lot of pixelation there. But then again, how often are you looking at the clouds? I don't think very often. We don't really pay attention to that. My recommendation, keep it on medium, because from low to medium, it's only 2% FPS decrease, and going on medium, it does, for the most part, eliminate that edges of the clouds thing. And also, speaking of particles, I compared explosions between low and epic, and I didn't see any difference whatsoever. So in my eyes, I think medium is the sweet spot just for the clouds. But if you want as many frames as possible, go with effects on low. And reflections have practically no impact. When I tested it in the swamp on the dam, from epic to low, it was 2% decrease. And if I went between high and epic, I didn't even see any quality difference. So my recommendation would be to keep it on high, as the frame rate cost is minimal. But if you are struggling for frames, just go to low and get those couple of extra frames out of it. And moving on to foliage, as you can see, foliage has a huge impact on how the ground feels like, or how the ground looks like. Where it doesn't have a massive FPS impact, it's only around 3% between epic to low. So my recommendation would be literally whatever is your personal preference. I personally think sometimes it's easier to see bodies on the ground if you've been fighting for a while. You know, sometimes you don't remember where you knock them out, and often they even crawl further away, so I think it's easier to find those bodies if the foliage is on low. But if you want that visual quality, then obviously go with epic or anything in between. Completely up to you. I'm just going for the competitive side this time, and I'm going with low. And global illumination resolution, it doesn't do absolutely anything. As you can see, nothing is changing here. The FPS difference is 3% though, if you go from low to epic or from epic to low. So my recommendation, my very, very high recommendation, is to keep it on low and just don't look at it again. In-game performance overlay, obviously, you can see your performance on the top right if you wish. Idle energy saving limits the frame rate to spare your PC and save energy while idling in the menu. Personal preference once again, but inactive window energy saving, I would recommend keeping disabled, just because when you're alt-tabbing, it's a tiny bit quicker. And I quickly want to go over audio as well. Having night mode on increases the ability to hear footsteps a lot better. I will throw in a demonstration right now. And as you can hear, there's a pretty big difference between what you can hear compared to night mode off. So I highly recommend put night mode on, and let's move on to the master volume. Obviously, this is once again personal preference. You obviously don't want to blow out your eardrums. I have found 65 to be the sweet spot for myself, but more importantly, you want to have effects as high as you possibly can, because that affects the volume of footsteps. Just to show it to you, if I turn effects to 0 and I run around, there's absolutely no audio here. At first, when I started playing, I turned effects to like 40%, and I was wondering why I couldn't hear footsteps, and that was the reason why, because I didn't have effects high enough, and obviously, in hindsight, it's very obvious, but I just did it in the tutorial, and I didn't think about it for a while, so my recommendation is get effects as high as possible and then play around with the master volume so you don't damage your ears, obviously. But that about concludes our video, my friends. I hope you got some frames out of it and maybe even a little bit of a competitive edge. If you wouldn't mind, drop a like and a sub, and I'll catch you in the next one, my friends. Take care.